The wind howled through the mountain peaks as Lauren Harris pressed her back against the rough wooden door of her cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. On the other side, she could hear his heavy boots shifting on the porch planks, could sense his massive presence waiting in the storm. "You're alone, woman," came the deep voice through the timber, each word deliberate and weighted with something she couldn't name. "Let me be the one to give you sons." The words hung in the frigid air between them, and Lauren's breath caught in her throat. 3 months she had been hiding in these mountains. 3 months since she had fled the scandal that had destroyed her life in the valley below. Now this stranger, this mountain man who moved like a shadow through the wilderness, stood at her threshold making a declaration that should have terrified her, but instead sent something entirely different coursing through her veins. Her fingers trembled as they traced the iron latch, and she found herself wondering how a woman's entire world could shift on the axis of a single moment, a handful of words spoken in the darkness of a winter storm. Outside, she could hear him breathing, patient as the mountains themselves, waiting for her answer to a question that would change everything. But to understand how Lauren Harris came to stand at that door, trembling between fear and an inexplicable longing, we must travel back to the beginning, to the day when her carefully ordered life began to crumble like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. The scandal had started with whispers in the general store of Cedar Falls, the kind of hushed conversations that died the moment Lauren entered a room. She had been the schoolmarm for 3 years, respected and admired. Living quietly in the boarding house on Maple Street, with her modest savings and her dreams of someday having a family of her own, the townspeople had trusted her with their children, had invited her to church socials and harvest festivals, had made her feel like she belonged somewhere for the first time in her life. All of that changed the morning Mrs. Catherine Bennett burst into the schoolhouse, her face flushed with righteous indignation, clutching a letter in her trembling hands. "How dare you," Catherine had hissed, waving the paper like a weapon. "How dare you corrupt our children with your lies?" Lauren had stared in bewilderment at the letter, recognizing her own handwriting, but not understanding how her private correspondence had ended up in Catherine's possession. It was a letter she had written to her sister back east, describing her loneliness, her doubts about faith, her questions about the rigid moral codes that seemed to strangle the life out of everything beautiful in the world. "I never meant for anyone else to read that," Lauren had whispered, but Catherine was already turning away, already spreading the poison through the town like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, the school board had dismissed her. By evening, the boarding house owner had asked her to leave. By the end of the week, Lauren Harris had become a pariah in the only place she had ever called home, branded as a dangerous free thinker whose very presence might corrupt the moral fabric of their community. She had packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, taken what little money she had saved, and fled into the mountains like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The cabin she found had been abandoned for years, its previous owner long dead, but it was sturdy enough to keep out the wind and rain, isolated enough that no one would think to look for her there. For 3 months, she had lived like a ghost among the pines, surviving on wild berries and the vegetables from a small garden she had managed to coax from the rocky soil. She chopped wood until her hands bled, hauled water from the creek until her back ached, and slowly learned the harsh lessons of mountain survival. The loneliness was the worst part. Days would pass without her hearing another human voice, and she found herself talking to the squirrels and birds just to remember what her own voice sounded like. At night, she would lie in the narrow bed and listen to the wind singing through the trees, wondering if this was how she would spend the rest of her days, forgotten by the world below. She first saw him on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the aspens had turned golden and the air carried the sharp promise of winter. Lauren had been gathering firewood near the creek when she caught a glimpse of movement through the trees, a figure so still and silent she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But then she saw him again the next day, and the day after that, always at the edge of her vision, never approaching but never truly leaving either. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. He moved through the forest with the fluid grace of someone who belonged there, who understood the language of wind and stone and growing things. Lauren began to leave small offerings on a fallen log near the creek, a biscuit here, a cup of coffee there, telling herself she was being neighborly even as her heart raced with the thrill of this strange, wordless communication. The offerings always disappeared, and sometimes she would find small gifts in return: a bundle of medicinal herbs, a perfectly carved wooden spoon, a deer hide soft as silk. She never saw him take the offerings or leave the gifts, but she knew it was him, this mysterious mountain man who watched over her from the shadows like some ancient guardian spirit. The first time she heard his voice, she was struggling to repair a section of roof that had been damaged in a storm. The ladder she had fashioned from fallen branches was unsteady, and she was stretching dangerously to reach a loose shingle when his voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Careful there!" She nearly fell in her surprise, spinning around to find him standing at the edge of her clearing, his hands loose at his sides, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I can manage," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her work-roughened hands, the stubborn set of her jaw. Then he nodded once and melted back into the forest as silently as he had appeared. But she knew he was still watching, still protecting her in his quiet way, and the knowledge filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt since before the scandal destroyed her life. The gifts became more frequent as the weeks passed, and more personal. A pair of rabbit fur mittens appeared on her doorstep one morning, perfectly sized for her small hands. A stack of seasoned firewood materialized beside her cabin while she slept. A haunch of venison hung from her porch beam, already cleaned and ready for cooking. Lauren began to understand that this was his way of courting her. This silent mountain man who spoke in gestures rather than words. In the world below, courtship involved flowers and poetry, formal calls and chaperone walks. Here in the wilderness, it involves survival and protection, the offering of necessities that meant the difference between life and death when winter came calling. She found herself watching for him constantly, her heart leaping whenever she caught a glimpse of his tall form among the trees. Sometimes she would see him working, splitting wood or checking snares, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had long ago learned to live in harmony with the harsh demands of mountain life. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun set behind the peaks, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was standing beside the creek, his shirt off as he washed in the icy water, and Lauren felt her breath catch at the sight of him. His body was a map of scars and hard-earned muscle, evidence of a life lived on the edge of survival. But there was something almost beautiful in the way he moved, something that spoke of strength tempered by gentleness. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them crackling with unspoken possibilities. Then he pulled his shirt back on and disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Lauren with her heart pounding and her cheeks burning with something that felt dangerously like desire. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind and wondering what it would be like to have someone to share the long, lonely hours with. Someone who understood the language of silence, who could read the stories written in the patterns of frost on the windows and the way the trees bent before the storm. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the mountains in pristine white and transforming Lauren's world into something from a fairy tale. But fairy tales, she knew, often had dark hearts, and winter in the high country was no exception. Her supplies were running dangerously low, and the game that had been plentiful in the fall had retreated to lower elevations or deep into hibernation. She rationed her food carefully, making thin soups from bones and scraps, but she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing day. It was during one of these difficult weeks that she woke to find fresh meat hanging from her porch beam, along with a sack of cornmeal and a jar of preserved vegetables. The gifts were more than generous, they were life-saving, and Lauren found herself crying with gratitude as she brought them inside. That evening, she built up her fire and cooked a proper meal for the first time in weeks. As she ate, she found herself speaking aloud to the empty cabin, addressing the man she knew was somewhere out there in the storm. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know why you're helping me, but thank you." The wind howled in response, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. But somewhere in that wild symphony, Lauren thought she heard something else. a presence that felt protective and warm despite the cold that pressed against her walls. She began leaving notes with her offerings at the creek, simple messages written on scraps of paper torn from her journal. The mittens are perfect. The venison was delicious. Thank you for watching over me. She never received written responses, but the gifts continued, each one perfectly chosen for her needs. A heavy wool blanket appeared during a particularly brutal cold snap. A pair of snowshoes materialized when the drifts grew too deep for her to reach the creek. A bottle of whiskey showed up when she was fighting off a fever, along with herbs that helped break the sickness that had settled in her chest. Through it all, she caught glimpses of him, a dark figure moving through the white landscape like a guardian angel. Sometimes she would see smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the forest and know that he had his own shelter, his own fire to ward off the killing cold. The knowledge that he was surviving out there, thriving even, filled her with a strange kind of pride, as if his strength reflected something within herself that she was only beginning to discover. Spring came late to the high country, arriving in fits and starts with warm days followed by sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter was reluctant to release its grip. Lauren had survived her first season in the mountains, and the knowledge filled her with a quiet confidence she had never possessed before. She was stronger now, both in body and spirit. Her hands were calloused from honest work, her arms corded with muscle from chopping wood and hauling water. Her face had been weathered by wind and sun into something that spoke of resilience rather than mere prettiness. She had learned to read the sky for signs of changing weather, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to set snares and preserve meat for the lean times. Most importantly, she had learned to be alone without being lonely, to find companionship in the voice of the wind and the company of wild creatures who had gradually accepted her presence in their domain. But she was not truly alone, and she knew it. Her silent guardian was never far away, his presence as constant as the mountains themselves. She had grown bold enough to leave longer notes, sharing her thoughts and observations about the changing seasons, the behavior of the wildlife, the small victories and setbacks of her daily existence. One morning in early May, she found a response waiting for her at the creek, scratched into the bark of a fallen aspen in letters that spoke of a careful, educated hand. "You write beautifully," the message read. "Your words paint pictures that warm the heart." Lauren traced the carved letters with her fingertips, her pulse racing at this first direct communication from the man who had become so important to her survival. That evening, she left a longer note, telling him about her life before the mountains, about the scandal that had driven her from civilization, about the loneliness that had nearly consumed her in those first terrible weeks. His response came 2 days later, carved into a smooth river stone that he left beside her usual offering spot. "The valley's loss is the mountain's gain. Some flowers bloom best in wild places." The words brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of something that felt dangerously close to joy. Here was someone who saw value in what the townspeople below had deemed worthless, who understood that sometimes what society called corruption was simply the natural impulse toward freedom and truth. Their correspondence continued through the spring and into early summer, a slow dance of revelation and growing intimacy conducted through carved messages and handwritten notes. Lauren learned that his name was Mark Johnson, that he had come to the mountains 5 years earlier after losing his wife and child to fever, that he had built a life of solitude that suited his wounded heart. She told him about her dreams of teaching, about the books she had read and loved, about the questions that had gotten her branded as a dangerous freethinker. She shared her fears and hopes, her growing love for the wild country that had become her refuge, her gratitude for his silent protection during the dark months of winter. Gradually, their meetings became less secretive. She would find him waiting by the creek when she came for water, would see him working in a meadow when she went to gather herbs. They never spoke at first, but their eyes would meet and hold, and Lauren began to understand that some conversations happened without words, that the deepest communication occurred in the space between heartbeats. The first time he spoke to her directly, she was struggling to move a fallen tree that blocked the path to her garden. She had been working for hours, her dress soaked with sweat, her hands raw from the rough bark, when his shadow fell across her. "Let me help," he said, his voice deep and gentle. Together they rolled the massive trunk aside, their hands brushing as they worked, sending electricity shooting up Lauren's arms. When the path was clear, they stood facing each other in the dappled sunlight, both breathing hard from the exertion. "Thank you," she said, and he nodded, his dark eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. "You've grown strong," he observed, and there was admiration in his voice that made her heart flutter like a bird taking wing. From that day forward, their relationship shifted into something more open, more acknowledged. He would appear to help with difficult tasks, would share meals on her porch when the evening was particularly fine, would walk with her through the forest paths as she gathered berries or herbs. They talked about books and philosophy, about the beauty of wild places and the harsh realities of survival. Mark was educated, she discovered, a former lawyer who had fled civilization after tragedy shattered his world. Like her, he had found healing in the mountains, had learned to read meaning in the flight patterns of birds and the changing colors of the seasons. Summer deepened into a golden haze of long days and warm nights, and Lauren found herself falling in love, not just with the mountain country, but with the quiet man who had made it possible for her to survive there. Mark was unlike any man she had ever known, comfortable with silence, but capable of profound insight when he chose to speak. He never pushed for more than she was willing to give, never made demands or assumptions about what their growing closeness might mean. Instead, he simply existed in her life like a natural force, steady and reliable as the sunrise, protective without being possessive. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Lauren found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. His face was weathered and scarred, marked by years of harsh living, but there was something beautiful in its rugged honesty, something that spoke of strength tempered by gentleness. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "The world below?" Mark was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then he turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "I miss who I was before," he said finally, "but that man died with his family. This life, this place, it's where I belong now." "And me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, vulnerable and raw in the night air. His hand found hers in the darkness, calloused fingers intertwining with her own. "You belong here too," he said simply. "You were made for wild places, Lauren Harris. The valley never deserved you." The words settled into her heart like seeds taking root, and she felt something shift inside her, some final wall crumbling to reveal the truth she had been afraid to acknowledge. She was in love with this mountain man, this gentle giant who had saved her life in ways both practical and profound. But love in the wilderness was different from love in civilization. She was learning. It was built on shared hardship and mutual respect, on the understanding that survival required partnership rather than pretty words and formal courtship rituals. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Lauren began to sense a change in Mark's behavior. He grew more protective, more watchful, spending longer hours near her cabin and making more frequent trips to check the snares and hunting trails that surrounded her small valley. When she asked him about it, he was evasive at first, but eventually he admitted that he had seen signs of other men in the area, strangers who had no business in the high country as winter approached. "Probably just hunters passing through," he said, but his eyes were troubled, and Lauren could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. She trusted his instincts completely by now, had learned that Mark's years in the wilderness had honed his senses to an almost supernatural degree. If he sensed danger, then danger was real, even if she couldn't see it herself. The first real sign of trouble came on a gray October morning when Lauren woke to find her snares disturbed and her small cache of preserved meat missing from the root cellar. Someone had been on her property during the night, someone who moved quietly but not quietly enough to escape Mark's notice. That evening, he appeared at her door with his rifle in his hands and a grim expression on his weathered face. "Pack what you can carry," he said without preamble. "You're coming with me tonight." Lauren's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't waste time with questions. She had learned to trust Mark's judgment absolutely, and if he said they needed to leave, then leaving was exactly what they would do. She gathered her most essential belongings, her few precious books, her warmest clothes, the small store of gold coins she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Within an hour, they were moving through the forest like shadows, following game trails that only Mark knew, heading deeper into the wilderness than Lauren had ever ventured. His cabin was hidden in a grove of ancient pines, so well concealed that she would never have found it without his guidance. It was larger than her abandoned home, built with the skill of someone who intended to spend years in the same place, furnished with handmade furniture and lined with shelves of books that spoke of a cultured mind seeking solace in learning. "You'll be safe here," Mark said as he built up the fire in the stone hearth. "They won't find this place." "Who won't find it?" Lauren asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Mark's face was granite hard in the firelight. "Men from the valley. They've been asking questions, following your trail. I think someone down there has decided you're worth hunting." The siege began 3 days later, when the first of the bounty hunters appeared at Lauren's abandoned cabin. Mark had positioned himself where he could watch the approaches, and he returned each evening with reports that made Lauren's blood run cold. There were 5 of them, rough men with the look of those who made their living through violence. They had torn her cabin apart looking for clues to her whereabouts, had questioned the few trappers and prospectors they encountered, had made it clear that they intended to find her no matter how long it took. "Someone's paying them well," Mark observed grimly. "This isn't just about bringing back a runaway schoolmarm. Someone wants you found for reasons of their own." Lauren thought of Catherine Bennett's furious face, of the righteous indignation that had driven her to destroy an innocent woman's life. It wasn't hard to imagine that same fury motivating a more direct form of revenge, especially if Catherine had convinced herself that Lauren posed some ongoing threat to the moral order of Cedar Falls. For a week, they played a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Mark using his superior knowledge of the terrain to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. But the hunters were persistent and well-equipped, and Lauren could see the strain wearing on her protector as the days stretched into a second week. It was on a night when the first serious snow of the season was falling that Mark made his decision. Lauren woke to find him standing by the window, his rifle in his hands, his face set in lines of grim determination. "They're getting close," he said without turning around. "Too close. It's time to end this." Lauren felt ice form in her stomach. "What do you mean?" Now he did turn, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was the look of a man who had found something worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. "I mean, I'm going to give them what they came for," he said quietly. "Me? No." The word tore from her throat like a physical thing. "Mark, no. We can keep running. We can find somewhere else to hide." He crossed to her in 2 quick strides, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "Listen to me," he said, his voice soft but implacable. "I've been running from life for 5 years, running from pain, from connection, from everything that makes existence worthwhile. But you changed that. You made me remember what it feels like to have something to protect, someone to care about." Tears were streaming down her cheeks now, but she didn't try to pull away from his touch. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me," she whispered, "and I won't let them take you back to a place that tried to destroy you," he replied. "Some things are worth fighting for, Lauren. You're worth fighting for." The confrontation came at dawn, when the snow was falling thick and heavy, and the world was muffled in white silence. Lauren watched from the cabin window as Mark walked out to meet the 5 hunters, his rifle held casually but ready, his tall form dark against the pristine landscape. She could hear their voices carrying on the thin mountain air, could see the tension in their postures as they faced off like gunslingers in some ancient ritual of masculine pride and territorial dominance. "You're harboring a fugitive," the leader called out, a man with cruel eyes and a badge that gleamed dully in the gray light. "I'm protecting a woman who's done nothing wrong," Mark replied, his voice carrying clearly despite the falling snow. "That's not for you to decide. She's wanted for questioning back in Cedar Falls, charges of moral corruption, disturbing the peace, corrupting the minds of children." Lauren felt sick at the litany of false accusations, at the way her private doubts and questions had been twisted into weapons against her. "She's not going back," Mark said flatly. "Find someone else to collect your blood money." The hunter's hand moved toward his gun, and Lauren's heart stopped beating. but Mark was faster. His rifle coming up in one smooth motion that spoke of years of practice and the kind of reflexes that kept men alive in dangerous country. "I wouldn't," Mark said conversationally, and something in his voice made all five men freeze. "You're a long way from civilization, boys. No witnesses, no law except what we make for ourselves. You sure you want to push this?" For a moment the tableau held, six men balanced on the knife's edge of violence while the snow fell around them like a benediction. Then the leader made his choice, his hand moving away from his weapon. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There'll be others. More money. More men. You can't protect her forever." "Maybe not," Mark agreed. "But I can protect her today and tomorrow, and as long as there's breath in my body." The hunters withdrew, but Lauren knew Mark was right about one thing. This wasn't over. There would be others, more determined, more dangerous. The scandal that had driven her from Cedar Falls had taken on a life of its own, become something larger and more vindictive than simple moral outrage. That night, as they sat by the fire listening to the wind howl through the pines, Mark took her hands in his and spoke the words that had been building between them for months. "Marry me," he said simply, "not for protection, not for convenience, but because I love you, because you've brought light back into a world that was nothing but shadows." Lauren looked into his weathered face, at the scars that told the story of his survival, at the eyes that held depths of tenderness she was still discovering. She thought of the woman she had been in Cedar Falls, constrained by other people's expectations, afraid to speak her truth or follow her heart. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to thrive in wild places. "Yes," she whispered, and the word hung between them like a promise, like a prayer answered by the ancient gods of mountain and storm. They were married the next morning by an old trapper who happened to be passing through, a man who asked no questions and required no papers, who understood that love in the wilderness followed its own laws. Lauren wore her best dress, the one she had saved from her teaching days, and Mark picked wildflowers from beneath the snow to make her a bouquet that would have shamed any hothouse rose. As they spoke their vows in the Cathedral of the Pines, with the snow falling around them like rice at a civilization wedding, Lauren felt the last chains of her old life fall away. She was no longer the disgraced school marm fleeing scandal. She was Lauren Johnson now, wife to a mountain man, partner in a life built on mutual respect and hard-won love. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain and challenging, but no longer lonely. There would be children, she knew. Sons and daughters who would grow up strong and free in this wild country, who would learn to read the language of wind and weather, who would understand that sometimes the greatest courage lay in choosing love over safety, truth over acceptance. And if more hunters came, if the scandal that had driven her from Cedar Falls continued to send men into the mountains, seeking to drag her back to a life that had never truly fit her, well, they would face those challenges together. Mark had been right about one thing. Some things were worth fighting for. Some loves were worth any price. As the old trapper pronounced them husband and wife, Lauren felt the mountain wind lift her hair like a blessing, felt the ancient peaks witness their union with approval. She had found her place at last, not in the tame valleys of civilization, but here in the wild heart of the world, where love grew strong as granite and enduring as the eternal snow. The storm that had driven her from her old life had carried her home.